Hey girl, hey, and welcome to the Self-Love Fix podcast, where we get relatable, we share tea, and we support each other on this journey of self-love, self-worth, personal development, self-esteem, and self-care. Because why wait until it's too late to start becoming the best version of ourselves? Let's start today. And I'm your host, Beatrice. So let's get into it. Hello. Last time on the pod, we talked about maintaining and protecting our energy. And if you haven't already listened to it, you should definitely listen to it. We talked about self-soothing and managing our emotions through the lens of energy work. And so this week, I really want to touch on something I've kind of been alluding to with each episode of this podcast, without actually naming it, and that's the ego. Now, before I jump into the episode, let me start off with this week's quote. The ego is not only the unobserved mind, the voice which pretends to be you, but also the unobserved emotions that are the body's reaction to what the voice in the head is saying. And that quote is by Eckhart Tolle. If you've never heard about Eckhart Tolle, he is one of my favorite spiritual teachers, for lack of better words, and the author of A New Earth and the Power of Now. You can find him on YouTube and on several of Oprah's Super Soul podcasts if you're interested in learning more about him. He has a fantastic way of describing the ego and breaking down how the ego can cause us much of the pain we experience in this life. Okay, so ego. I'm sure you're thinking, I know what that is already. You don't have to teach me. You might be thinking it's a way to describe people who are full of themselves. Or if you've taken a psych class or two, you might say that the ego is one of the three parts of the psyche that Sigmund Freud discovered, or the part of the psyche that functions in reality and mediates between the impulsive thoughts and wants of the id and the moral portion of your psyche, the superego. If this is what you think of the ego, you're absolutely not wrong. But there's more to the ego than many of us think. And in this episode, we are going to go deeper into the world of the ego. Now, this episode is only an introduction, but in this episode, I hope to reintroduce you to just who the ego is. So the ego helps us navigate this world. There's no doubt about it. But the ego is only concerned with everything it sees on a physical and material level. Not only is it concerned with it, it identifies only with it, meaning our ego is the portion of the self that identifies with our accomplishments, our hurt, our pain, our beliefs, our thoughts, our views, our desires, our wants, etc. The ego by itself cannot see outside of itself. It is preoccupied with protecting what it believes makes it up. Again, namely, its hurt, its pain, its beliefs, its thoughts, its views, its desires, and its wants. So this means whenever someone challenges anything it believes, it has to protect it, and it does it by lashing out. Why does the ego do this? Because the ego sincerely believes that anything that does not agree with it or see things as it does is an enemy and sees it as a threat to its survival. I know it sounds crazy, but the ego believes it only survives by way of asserting itself and its beliefs and attacking anything or anyone that does not do so. That is, anyone that does not support or reinforce its beliefs and desires and wants. Okay, so that was a lot. When I say all this about the ego, I'm not saying the ego is bad. I'm not saying that having thoughts and beliefs and desires is bad. What I'm saying is that identifying with the ego only is what we call identifying with the false self. What I'm saying is that the ego is the false self. This may come as a shock to you, as you might believe you are your beliefs, that you are your accomplishments, that you are your desired. But I'm here to tell you that you are not. I'm also here to tell you that if there's a false self, there's also a true self. That is the highest self. In a healthy, functioning person, you have both the ego and the highest self, or the true self. But the true self transcends the ego or the false self. The true self is able to keep the ego in check and keep it from wiling out. Now, you should know that there are, in fact, people who operate solely on the ego and do not have the ability to have their highest self or true self to check their ego. These people have what we call cluster B personality disorders, and they are people with antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and histrionic personality disorder. Now, this is on the extreme end of the spectrum of identifying with ego. There are also people who are just self-absorbed or egotistical who still identify with the ego but have the ability to access their true self. It would just take a little bit of work on their end. So what does this look like? With people who are egotistical but do not have a personality disorder, they may identify heavily with their ego such that if people don't agree with their beliefs, they may feel personally attacked and hurt. And if things don't go their way, they might have a small burst of anger but later recover and will eventually apologize. They may talk a lot about themselves and their accomplishments, but will stop and apologize if you say something about it. So and of course there are more things that identify people who are egotistical, but those are just a few of the things I named. So you can see with people who are egotistical, they can self-regulate if someone lets them know about themselves. But as you can see, it sometimes and most times usually takes someone else to help them kickstart that self-regulation. Whereas with people with cluster B personality type disorders that I described earlier, the identification with the ego is much more extreme and even dangerous. So what does that look like? It looks like people who attack you with name calling and insults if you disagree with their beliefs. When they don't get what they want, they'll have bursts of anger too, but they'll be much larger and much more disproportionate to the actual scenario that's going on. For example, they may yell and scream at a waiter who took too long to take their order, and they will likely hurl insults at the waiter, calling him things like lazy or saying they don't know how to do their job. The person with the personality disorder is completely clueless as to how inappropriate their actions are. They think it's justified because they didn't get their food ordered when they expected to. And lastly, they will talk so much about themselves and their accomplishments and times where they did heroic things to the point that you would think they were having literally a soliloquy on stage. And if you told them that they talk a lot, they would hurl insults at you, deny the behavior, and actually tell you that you're the one who talks too much. Quick side note, they do this because the ego does not like to believe that it is that it is capable. I'm having a really hard time talking today, I'm going to be honest. But the ego does not like to believe that it is capable of doing things that are not pleasing to others. So to distract you from thinking they have an egoic flaw, they will accuse you of their very behaviors. I know, crazy. Also, another side note, if I mix up my words, I promise you it's Mercury retrograde, okay? I just feel like communication is just bad all around, but it's only until July 31st, so we're gonna be okay. Continuing on with the podcast. So hopefully now you're getting a clearer picture of what the false self is. Now, you must be wondering, okay, what then is the true self? The true self is your spirit self. The true self completely transcends the ego and is pure love. That's right. At the core of who you are pure love. And from all the different religions and spiritual teachers, we learn that love is pure and forgiving, patient, not self-seeking, not attached to the feelings and thoughts and actions of others. It's understanding, it's concerned with truth, and it is just and brings things to justice, and it empathizes and it holds space for others. This is what love is, and that is who you are at the core, underneath your ego. Now, what does it look like when you let your highest self guide you and when you let it transcend your ego? It looks like when someone disagrees with your beliefs, you realize that they are not disagreeing with you personally. They are just letting you know that they don't hold the same belief, and that's okay because you realize that everyone has a different worldview, and someone disagreeing with yours is not a direct attack to you or a direct attack on you, but rather it is just a declaration of their own beliefs. The true self understands that because it holds space for many different views and experiences, that the aim isn't to be right or wrong, but rather to understand. But the ego is narrow and is only concerned with being right. It fears if someone disagrees with it that it is inherently wrong, and it shuts down even at the thought. The true self does not seek to be right or wrong, it seeks to understand. It looks like when you don't get what you want or you don't get your way, sure, you may be upset, but you don't get enraged and act out of the emotion. You breathe in, breathe out, and figure out how to go about the situation in a calm manner. The true self understands that the reason you didn't get something your way could be dependent on many different factors. For example, going back to the waiter example from earlier, if you let your true self guide you, you would realize that there could be many reasons the waiter took a while to get to you. And while that isn't the best service, you understand that likely they are understaffed, or it may be their first day on the job and they even forgot that they had your table. So many different reasons. Those are just two of the many that could be. The true self makes space for several different realities. I'm going to say that again because some of y'all are not going to catch that. The true self makes space for several different realities. The ego only makes space for one reality, its own. It does not have the ability to understand anything outside of what it experiences, so it takes anything that it experiences personally. Lastly, having a true self that transcends ego looks like having conversations with people that are balanced between you speaking and them speaking, and do not involve long speeches of accomplishments and achievements that go on and on without someone's asking. The false self feels as though it has to brag and has to discuss achievements and accomplishments, and does not hold space for others to do the same, because the false self finds its identity only in those things and feels it must constantly express its identity in that way because it fears disappearing or becoming irrelevant. The true self holds space for others to speak and share about themselves because the true self is expansive, and the true self believes in abundance. The true self understands that someone else having the spotlight for a moment or two does not take away from its worth or value. It understands that they can learn things from others and seeks to establish and deepen relationships with others. The true self understands that its existence is not dependent on what others think or feel about it. It understands its worth does not come from others affirming or validating it. It comes from the fact simply that it exists. The false self / the ego seeks only to build itself up again because it has a constant fear of ceasing to exist. The ego is very linear. It cannot see the whole picture. It thinks that it can disappear, it can die. It's very concerned with its survival, if that's making sense to you. And, hopefully now you are seeing how the ego and the true self compare. And hopefully you can see how the ego is like a cloak that helps you to navigate the world. Because after all, we are individuals. And the ego helps us orient ourselves as individuals in this world, and to help us know our boundaries, our likes, our desires, and our wants. But hopefully now you can see that it's not our true self. We do not want to be ruled by our ego. We want to be led by our true self, our highest self, while our ego kind of takes the back seat along for the ride. When we let the ego take the driver's seat, we find ourselves taking everything personally. We find ourselves functioning in one-dimensional thinking, very anxious and preoccupied because we are dependent on the affirmation of others to carry our lives out, and we depend on what they think to function. We have trouble seeing others for who they are because ego only makes space for seeing others only as it understands others, as opposed to being open and empathizing and understanding what others have to say about themselves. And it can prevent us from owning up to our shortcomings because ego believes apologizing and admitting fault is equivalent to admitting it is a failure and it is unworthy. When we learn to operate in our true self instead of in our ego, life becomes expansive. We begin to see life as a multidimensional life and a life full of possibilities. We begin to see life as abundant. We begin to be free of the burden of perfectionism and worrying about others' judgments and worrying about others' opinions. Whew. That was heavy, right? And that was just an introduction. I wish I could fit in everything about the ego into this episode, but understanding the true self and the ego is something we will continue to explore in this podcast. So sit back and relax because we are just getting started. And I hope you guys have a great weekend and do lots of fun things. Thank you for tuning in this week. Have a great weekend.